Now, this is stopped at a moment which is right around the time, I think we're maybe a frame or two before Mr. Rittenhouse fires and the shots at Mr. Rosenbaum. And everyone can see where you're at in relation to that. What I want you what I'd like you to do, Mr. McGinnis, is tell the jury in your own words, what was going on at this particular moment where we stopped in the video.
So basically, I was running behind Mr. Rittenhouse and Mr. Rosenbaum, and like I mentioned before, Mr. Rittenhouse turned around and Mr. Rosenbaum continued, and I was continuing, but then I realized, that they were about to basically collide, and so at that moment, I was still running, but just before the shots, I kind of altered my trajectory of my run a little bit in the direction that I perceived to be out of harm's way.
What do you mean harm's way? You were several feet away from them. What was the harm to you?
Well, once Mr. Rittenhouse turned around and Mr. Rosenbaum continued, it was a very short, very, very short period of time from when he turned around to when the shots were fired. And basically in that very short period of time, I realized that Mr. Rosenbaum was continuing to advance, and that Mr. Rittenhouse was standing still, and that they would be, based on Mr. Rosenbaum's, the way that he was running, and then eventually lunging towards the front portion of the rifle, it was clear to me that something with the weapon was about to happen, and I didn't want to be on the wrong side of that.
When you say something with the weapon was about to happen, what do you mean?
Well, it wasn't clear to me whether the weapon would be grabbed or fired or what exactly was going to happen, but it was clear to me that it was a situation where it was likely that something dangerous was going to happen, be it Mr. Rosenbaum grabbing it, Mr. Rittenhouse shooting it. I didn't know, but I knew that my eyes at that moment were, like in this exact moment, were fixated on the barrel of the weapon, because I didn't want to end up on the receiving end of that.
You said your eyes were focused on the barrel of the weapon.
Yes.
Where was the barrel of the weapon pointed?
At this moment, when he stopped, it was aimed about 45 degrees at the ground.
Did the aim of the barrel of the weapon change?
It did. And when Mr. Rosenbaum lunged, Mr. Rittenhouse kind of dodged around. And then that's when it was leveled at Mr. Rosenbaum and fired.
What was the position of Mr. Rosenbaum's body when the defendant fired at him?
Well, there were 4 shots, but it was like in one continuous motion. It was like a lunge towards the front portion, a dodge around, and when he missed, his momentum continued forward.
I'm going to stop you for 1 second.
Yeah.
When he missed, who's he?
Mr. Rosenbaum, I'm sorry.
Please
Yes.
continue.
When Mr. Rosenbaum did not make contact with Mr. Rittenhouse, or it wasn't clear to me whether or not they made contact, but what was clear to me was that the trajectory of the rifle wasn't really altered by Mr. Rosenbaum's lunge. So if they did make contact, then it was just a glance. It wasn't enough to alter the trajectory of the rifle, but and again, this is just because that was the only thing that I was looking at that point, and it's not clear to me whether he basically fell forward, but that was as.
I'm going to stop you for a second because you said he again. Can you?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Rosenbaum.
Okay. He fell forward.
Yes, like it was as if, if you were to lunge at somebody, if anybody were to lunge, they'd probably stop themselves, from falling face down on the ground, but the shots were fired in the exact instance that his momentum was going forward, and that continued until Mr. Rosenbaum landed on the ground.
When Mr. Rosenbaum landed on the ground after being shot by the defendant, what was Mr. Rosenbaum's body position?
He was lying face down.
Is it fair to say, if I'm understanding your testimony correctly, that when the defendant shot Mr. Rosenbaum was already falling forward?
His I wouldn't say falling, I would say his momentum was definitely going forward. It's not clear, to me whether he would have, I guess, fallen if, the shots hadn't been fired, but certainly his momentum was in the forward direction, and also his hands were out in front of his feet, such that, his center of gravity was beyond where his feet were.
You gave an interview in which you characterized this incident as the defendant shooting Mr. Rosenbaum while Mr. Rosenbaum was falling. Do you recall saying that in an interview?
There were 4 shots, so I don't recall specifically saying that, but was that the direct quote?
Let's put it up on the screen.
I'm told that Ed Staley is here early, so I'll give you a few more minutes. Do you want to continue?
Could we just finish this little piece up and then I'll break? Can we play this starting at the 52-second mark, please?
Well, Tucker, I was just about 10 or 12 feet behind them as they ran into the parking lot, and what I saw was Rosenbaum pursuing Rittenhouse, and Rittenhouse turned around. Now, right before he turned around, I'm not sure if this was a reason why he turned around, but there was a gunshot, and that's actually visible on video. It's not clear whether or not that gunshot was fired into the air or towards Rittenhouse, but Rittenhouse did turn around immediately after that. And at that point, he went from running away to aiming his weapon at Rosenbaum, and I was actually directly behind Rosenbaum. So I took 1 or 2 steps to my right as Rosenbaum was lunging for the barrel of the rifle, and he was that close to him. And Rittenhouse actually took the barrel of the rifle and just dodged around. And at that point, as Rosenbaum was falling forward, he fired quickly 4 shots into Rosenbaum. And at that point, I was only about...
We just played an excerpt from a video interview that you did with Tucker Carlson on Fox News. Do you recall this interview?
Yes.
And the date of this interview is August 28th, 2020.
Yes.
Does that sound about right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's 3 days after the event occurred. Is that fair to say?
I think it was so it happened on a Tuesday, and I believe that was Friday.
Sure, 3 days later.
Mm-hmm.
Fair to say that on Friday after this incident, your memory of it might be better than it is 14 months later?
It's just the same. I'm never going to forget it.
Generally speaking, people's memory is better when it's closer in time. You'd agree with that?
Yeah.
And you mentioned seeing some other videos before you gave this interview to Tucker Carlson. So you had watched some things in those 3 days, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. But in this video here, you are telling Fox News, Tucker Carlson, that the defendant shot Mr. Rosenbaum as Mr. Rosenbaum was falling forward, correct?
Yeah, it's unclear to me because the shots were so quick whether, the shots are the reason why he, because he lunged and then the shot was fired as he was lunging, so it was like, I guess, perhaps it was the shots that caused him to then, rather than stopping himself, just fall flat.
That's not what you just said. Let's play this back about 20 seconds, please.
For the barrel of the rifle, and he was that close to him. And Rittenhouse actually took the barrel of the rifle and just dodged around. And at that point, as Rosenbaum was falling forward, he fired quickly 4 shots into Rosenbaum.
Your interview 3 days after this incident says that Mr. Rosenbaum was already falling forward when the defendant used the gun and discharged the shots.
I don't see why that's inconsistent with what I'm saying right now. He was lunging, falling, I would use those as synonymous terms in this situation because basically, he threw his momentum towards the weapon, and when the weapon wasn't there, his momentum was continuing, and that's the point at which he fired. So if you use the word falling or lunging, his momentum was going forward, and that's the point at which he fired the shots.
That's exactly what I'm getting at. A few seconds ago, you were saying that you weren't sure if Mr. Rosenbaum started falling because he was shot. But in your interview here, the falling is occurring before the defendant even shoots Mr. Rosenbaum.
That's not what I said.
According to your interview,
let me clarify. I said that I wasn't sure if he didn't catch himself because he was shot. Because you can lunge forward and then put your foot out and stop yourself from falling. So
Sure.
It wasn't clear to me, for example, if the shots had not been fired, it's not clear to me whether he would have fallen or whether he would have caught himself. That's what I meant when I said that.
At any rate, your statement in this interview and what you're telling us here today in person is that Mr. Rosenbaum was already falling forward when the defendant shot him. Is that
Yes,
accurate?
his momentum was going forward. I don't know, this term falling, I just wouldn't use that. So I'm not going to say that because that's not what I said.
You actually have said that. I'm using your
I'm not
words.
going to say that right now because I'm clarifying.
Don't comment on the witness's testimony.
It's correct. It was a
You can-
live
no,
interview.
no. You can ask questions, but don't comment on the witness's testimony.
Fair enough. At any rate, whether it's the momentum, falling, however you want to put it, Mr. Rosenbaum was in that motion
Yes.
before the defendant shot him.
Yes.
Okay. We can take a break now, Your Honor.
All right, let's take a break. Folks, please don't talk about the case during the break. Read, watch, or listen to any account of the trial. Any questions, anybody? Okay, thank you. I didn't even tell them that. I usually keep it a secret, and then they eat faster. But I was going to say about 12:30. But if you have it's something you have to do or something. Okay, let's aim for 12:30.